Okay, we're going to talk about Antiochus Epiphanes and Daniel 8. Why is it that Antiochus is not the one in view? Crucial to the interpretation of Daniel 8, 9 through 14 is the identification of the little horn power, which dominates these verses. Attempting to identify this little horn, commentators have applied three different methods: preterist, futurist, and historicist prophetic interpretations. Preterists teach that the majority of Daniel's prophecies have already been fulfilled and therefore have no present significance. They hold that the little horn rose from one of the divisions of Alexander's empire. They specifically identify it with the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes from 175 to 164 BC. Futurists follow this basic line of interpretation as well, though they see Antiochus as a type of an end-time Antichrist appearing in the final years of Earth's history. Historicists declare that the prophecies in Daniel portray an outline of human and ecclesiastical history from ancient Babylon right down to the end of time. The little horn power being identified as the Roman Empire in chapter 7, just prior to chapter 8 in Daniel, in both its pagan and papal stages. Just as there are three main identifications for the little horn, three main applications have been made of the time period. The 2300 evening mornings in Daniel 8:14, which involve the activity of the little horn. Preterists have proposed that the 2300 evening mornings means 2300 individual morning and evening sacrifices, or 1,150 or half literal days. Evening and morning, 2300 evenings and mornings would be half that many days, which should be then applied to Antiochus Epiphanes. Some futurists have seen the evening mornings as literal evenings and mornings, or 2300 literal days, but place them in the future during the time of an end-time Antichrist, although that's fallen much out of favor, it seems, or not a lot of people pushing that anymore. Utilizing the day for a year principle, historicists have held that this time prophecy refers to a period of 2300 years, which began sometime in the 5th century BC and ended in the 19th century AD, or the 1800s. Finally, how do the various schools interpret this sanctuary that's cleansed at the end of the time period depicted in Daniel 8:14? Preterists claim it refers to the purification of the temple in Jerusalem after Antiochus polluted it. Futurists hold that during the final 7 years of Earth's history, a literal temple to be rebuilt in Jerusalem will be polluted by an Antichrist, but cleansed or restored when Christ comes. In contrast, because the earthly temple was destroyed in AD 70, and this prophetic time period extends beyond this point, historicists see in it a reference to the cleansing of the temple in heaven. The best way to understand the prophecy is to study it in context of other chapters in Daniel that parallel it, particularly Daniel 7. By comparing the two chapters, we can learn not only which school of prophetic thought best explains the vision of Daniel 8, but we can see the identification of the little horn as Antiochus Epiphanes simply is not tenable. In Daniel 7, with the exception of some voices within the preterist camp, most conservative scholars depict the identity of the four beasts in Daniel as follows: Babylon, the head of gold; Medo-Persia is the silver; the bear; the leopard is Greece; and the beast with iron teeth is Rome. Almost universally accepted, except for some schools of preterism actually make the Medes and Persians and then Greece the final, and then associate that with the final kingdom, but most do not do that. Historicists and futurists do diverge, however, when they come to the little horn that arises out of the fourth power, Rome. See Daniel 7, 8 through 9, verses 20 through 21, and 24 through 25. The former, that is the historicists, identified as Papal Rome, which came out of pagan Rome, the latter holding to a gap in the flow of prophetic history, identify it as the still future Antichrist. While acknowledging, as all the schools do, that the first beast is Babylon, the preterist interpretation identifies the second and third beast of Daniel 7 as Media and then Persia, with the fourth beast being Greece, which arises out of Persia, and the little horn coming out of Greece as Antiochus Epiphanes. This argument, however, falls apart on numerous grounds, including the lack of historical data to warrant the separation of Media and Persia into two successive kingdoms. In contrast, support for the interpretation of Daniel 7 as being Babylon, then Media Persia being one, and then Greece and then Rome can be found in the interpretation of the ram in Daniel 8. Its two disproportionate horns are specifically identified as the kings of Media and Persia together. Verse 20 in Daniel 7. Or Daniel 8, actually, I think. Yeah, Daniel 8:20. Reflective of the duality found in the prophet's view of the bear in Daniel 7, which was raised up on one side, Daniel 7:5. Meanwhile, the three-directional nature of the ram's conquest, Daniel 8:4, also parallels the three ribs depicted in the mouth of the bear in Daniel 7:5. Since it expanded to the north towards Lydia, and to the west Babylon, and to the south Egypt, an accurate description of the Media-Persian expansion. Thus, if in Daniel 7, Media-Persia is the second beast and Greece the third, then the nondescript beast, the fourth beast in the prophecy, must represent Rome, the great power that arose after Greece. Therefore, the little horn that came from the fourth beast cannot represent Antiochus IV, who arose prior to and not after Rome. Thus, if the little horn in Daniel 8 is an entity that came out of Rome, not Greece, what is its relationship to the little horn in Daniel chapter 8? Could the little horn in 8 still be Antiochus Epiphanes, even though the little horn in Daniel 7 cannot? Though it's certainly possible that it could be referring to two different powers, significant arguments exist in favor of identifying the little horn in these two chapters as the same historical entity. Both are identified with the same symbol, a horn, the little horn. Both are described as little. Both are described as becoming great later on. Both are described as persecuting powers in 7:21 and 25, and in 8:10 and 8:24. Both have the same target group as an object of their persecution, 7:27 and 8:24. Both are described as self-exalting and blasphemous powers. Both are described as crafty and intelligent. Both represent the final and great anti-God climax of their visions. Both have aspects of their work delineated by prophetic time. The activities of both extend to the end of time. You can see that how Daniel 8 is clearly the same person as the king of the north, or the enemy of God, you can still say it that way, in chapter 11. Who opposes the covenant of God. And chapter 11, if you carefully go from the end of chapter 11 into chapter 12, recognizing there was no chapter breaks in the original manuscript, you realize this same person in chapter 8 is the same person in chapter 11. In chapter 11 into chapter 12 takes you right down to the second coming of Christ. Both are to be supernaturally destroyed without hand. How much more evidence does one need? The little horn power of Daniel 7 and the little horn power of Daniel 8 are both the same entity. And because the little horn in Daniel 7 cannot be Antiochus Epiphanes, the little horn in Daniel 8 can't be either. Meanwhile, textual evidence within Daniel 8 itself also helps debunk the Antiochus interpretation for the little horn. Because Antiochus is commonly identified with the little horn of Daniel 8, arguments favoring this identification will be considered first. Antiochus was a Seleucid king, as one of this dynasty who assumed control in part of Alexander's old empire. Alexander did proceed from the breakup of the Grecian Empire after the death of Alexander. Antiochus' succession was irregular. According to the chapter, this little horn arose, but not with his power, which suggests that the little horn came to power through an irregular succession. A son of Seleucus IV should have succeeded to the rule after his father's assassination. However, the king's brother Antiochus came to the throne instead, aided by the armies of Pergamus. It is possible to apply the phrase, but not by his own power, to this course of events. 3. Antiochus did persecute the Jews. 4. Antiochus did pollute the Jerusalem temple and disrupted its services. However, it remains to be seen whether he did all the things against the temple that Daniel 8 says the little horn does. Meanwhile, there are a number of arguments from Daniel 8 against equating Antiochus with the little horn. For one, comparative greatness of the little horn. In the chapter, the Persian ram magnified himself, chapter 8, verse 4. The Grecian goat magnified himself exceedingly, chapter 8, verse 8. By contrast, the little horn magnified itself exceedingly in different directions. On the horizontal level, it grew exceedingly great towards the south, east, and glorious land. On the vertical plane, it grew great to the host of heaven, and ultimately magnified itself up to the prince of the host. Verses 9 through 11. The verb to be great, gadol, occurs only once, each with Persia and Greece, but it appears 3 times with the little horn. In other words, the little horn was greater than the 2 powers that preceded it in the chapter, which means Antiochus should have exceeded the Media-Persian and Greek empires in greatness. Obviously, he did not. He wasn't even close. Indeed, he ruled only one portion of the Grecian Empire and did that with but little success. Let's see. Indeed, he ruled only one portion of the Grecian Empire and did with little success, but at the crucial point, Antiochus fails miserably. 2. Conquest. The horn grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. To the south, the predecessor to Antiochus was the king who added Palestine to the territory ruled by the Seleucids when he defeated armies at Peneus in 198 BC. Antiochus attempted to extend his southern frontier into Egypt with the campaign of 170 through 168 BC. He was successful in conquering most of the delta in 169 BC. The following year, 168, he marched on Alexandria but was turned back by a Roman diplomatic mission and had to abandon his Egyptian conquests. Thus, his partial success in Egypt was transitory, and it is doubtful that he really did grow exceedingly great toward the south. Regarding to the east, Antiochus's predecessor, not Antiochus himself, subjugated the east with his victorious campaigns in 210 to 206 BC. That took to the frontier of India. Most of these territories rebelled and became independent. However, after the Romans defeated him at Magnesia, Antiochus attempted to regain some of this territory. After some initial diplomatic and military successes, his forces stalled. He died during the course of these campaigns, apparently from natural causes in the winter of 164 BC. Antiochus did have some initial successes. He did not accomplish nearly as much in this area as his predecessor did. And this project was left incomplete at Antiochus's death. Thus, his partial and incomplete military successes hardly match the prophetic prediction of the little horn growing exceedingly great towards the east. To the glorious land. Antiochus is noted in 1 Maccabees 1 through 6 as the ruler who desecrated the temple and persecuted the Jews. This did not occur because of any conquest of his own, but because his predecessor had already taken Palestine. Antiochus, therefore, could not have grown exceedingly great toward the glorious land, Judea, presumably, in any sense of military conquest. He could have He could have grown exceedingly only in the sense of exercising or abusing his control over what was already part of his kingdom when he came to the throne. Indeed, not only was Antiochus not the conqueror of Palestine, but defeats of his forces toward the end of his reign in the region eventually led to the complete independence of Judea. While he was campaigning in the east, his Palestinian forces were beaten. See 1 Maccabees 3, verse 57, and chapter 4, verse 29. In Judea, they were beaten. Toward the end of 164 BC, the Jews liberated the polluted temple from their hands and rededicated it. Antiochus died in the east shortly thereafter. In short, the net result of Antiochus' accomplishes in these three geographical spheres was negligible, even in some cases negative. Thus, he hardly fits the specification of this prophecy, which states that the little horn has to grow exceedingly great towards the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land.
Antiochus and the commentaries. If you have watched the video or read some of the resources on the topic of Antiochus in the resource sections, you know that the Antiochus interpretation cannot work for the little horn. It cannot fit in any way. The texts do not allow for it. Study it yourself, you'll see. Now, here's a fact. It's important to remember this. Pretty much any commentary that you pick up today, liberal commentary, conservative, Protestant, evangelical, Jewish, almost all of these commentaries, and most likely without any exception, will identify that little horn power of Daniel 8 as Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And frankly, they're all wrong. Again, don't take my word for it. Just look carefully at the text. Look at what we have shown, and you can know for yourself that they are wrong. Now, the point I want to make is this. You have to be prepared that if you were to give someone a study on 1844 and they went on their own and did a little research, every commentary they pick up would tell them that Antiochus is the little horn. Now, some commentaries will say that it's also some type of final Antichrist too, the little horn, which no question is a lot closer to the meaning of the text than the Antiochus interpretation is. But this multiple fulfillment idea, which we have touched on in the resources, but we'll explore more later, doesn't work here either. The point is just be prepared for it. That's all. And the key to be prepared for it is very simple. Just know the text well enough to see why the interpretation is wrong. Now, why do they get it wrong? Well, that's a long story with a long history. But my simple response is, so what? I mean, folks, these commentaries are written by fallible human beings who probably also believe that the Sabbath was changed to Sunday, or that the day doesn't matter, or that the dead are burning in hell right now, or the saved are with Jesus in heaven, or whatever. I mean, who cares what others say? What matters is that we can carefully look at the text and see how impossible the Antiochus interpretation really is. I mean, folks, look at it like this. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, King Antiochus Epiphanes IV, then God's eternal kingdom right after. Come on, that's ludicrous. How about Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, pagan Rome followed by papal Rome all through history, then God's eternal kingdom? Of course, it makes so much better sense. And the reason it makes better sense is simple. It's because it's true. Orthodox Jews and the link between Daniel 8 and Daniel 9. If you saw the video, you remember that we looked at Daniel 8, and we saw that Daniel 8 was composed of basically just 4 elements: a ram, a goat, a little horn, and the sanctuary being cleansed. And we saw the ram was explained, the goat was explained, the little horn was explained. The only thing that wasn't explained was the vision of the evening and mornings, Daniel 8:14. That was the only thing he didn't understand. And later on in the chapter, Daniel 8:26, he's told in the vision of the evening and mornings, which is verse 14, he's told is true. And then in verse 27 in Daniel 8, he's very clear that he wondered at the vision and he did not understand it. And the only thing he didn't understand was the vision, the mare of the evening and mornings of verse 14. Then we went over to Daniel 9, and we saw we had Daniel's prayer. Nowhere did Daniel, anywhere in his prayer, ask for an understanding. The last place we needed Daniel needing an understanding was regard to the vision of the evening and morning. And then we saw the angel Gabriel appears to him and tells him that, I've now come to give the understanding. He says, therefore, consider the matter and understand the vision. Well, the last vision Daniel did not understand was the vision of the evening and mornings, Daniel 8:14, which was a time prophecy. And then the very next verse in Daniel 9:24, he says, 70 weeks are cut off on thy people, or decreed upon thy people. So the point is, we have argued that the vision of the 70-week prophecies is part of Daniel 8:14, and that they're linked. In fact, they are really even one prophecy. So we argue that there's a close link between Daniel 8 and Daniel 9, and the link is found in Daniel 9:23 and 24. Anyway, with that background now, I've often wondered, what do Orthodox Jews do with the 70-week prophecy, Daniel 8 and Daniel 9? Well, I have had for a number of years an Orthodox Jewish commentary on the book of Daniel. It's called the Art Scrolls series. And I went in one day and I said, what do the Orthodox Jews do with these prophecies? And I looked, and I want to show you one point in particular. Obviously, there's not going to be a lot we agree with, but there's one thing I want to show you. Now, if you look at the podcast here, you look on the PDF right below the player. It says Danielton Art Scrolls series. I'm going to give you a second. Click on that. Click that open down below, and a page should show up. And what you have here is you've got page 258 and 259 of that book. Now, you'll notice if you look in the right-hand corner, page 258 is on the right and 259 is on the left. Hebrew reads from right to left, and it can be a little confusing if you're not familiar with it because they mixed Hebrew and English here. But if you listen to what I say and follow the colors, it'll be very simple. Anyway, look at this page. Now, you'll notice up in the far right, you'll see the Hebrew. That's basically Daniel 9:23. The gist of it, the end of Daniel 9:22 and the beginning of 9:24, which is the 70-week prophecy. But the gist of it is verse 23. Then if you look over on your left, you'll see the translation of it. Now, look at the red. At the beginning of your supplication, this is the beginning of Daniel 9:23. At the beginning of your supplications, a word came forth, and I have come to relate it for you, beloved are you. Contemplate the matter and gain, and look at the yellow now, and gain understanding in the vision. We're really going to focus on that yellow. What is that saying there? Gain understanding in the vision. And then right after, you'll see we've got 70 weeks have been decreed. We've got the 70-week prophecy. So the point is, this is the focus here on this page is an understanding of Daniel 9:23. Now, if you shift now over to the right where you see the red, and you see there's some Hebrew wording, and it says, at the beginning of your supplications. What you see now in there and below it, in the column there and in the column to the right, is now the commentary explaining some of the different phrases in Daniel 9:23, just the way our commentaries would. So he says, at the beginning of your supplication, then he goes down. If you'll see a little further, a word went forth, and he's explaining that. Then you go over to the right for beloved are you, and so on. And he's going through bit by bit in Daniel 9:23. Now, come down to the yellow. This yellow here is the same yellow that's in English up there, and gain understanding of the vision. That's up in the translation on the left. Now we're getting the explanation. And it's, you see in the yellow, and gain understanding in the vision. V'habein ba'mare, understand that vision. Okay? Now, what do the Orthodox Jews, how do they explain this? What do they say this means? Now look at the blue and read with me. They say, and I read, quote, this refers to Daniel's vision in chapter 8. Notice it's bringing you right back to Daniel 8. This refers to Daniel's vision in chapter 8, in which the part which disturbed him. So verse 14 is characterized, it goes on, as a mare. But look what they're doing. The Orthodox Jews, Daniel 9:23, understand the vision. And just as we do, they instantly point you right back to Daniel 8:14, exactly as we do. Now, does this prove absolutely the link between Daniel 8:14 and Daniel 9:23 and 24? It doesn't prove it absolutely. But what it does prove absolutely is that we are not the only ones to see the link. And you see these Orthodox Jews who certainly don't have the same agenda that we do. They see clearly the link between Daniel 8:14 and Daniel 9:23-24, just as we as Adventists do. Absolute proof, no, but powerful evidence in favor of how we understand those two prophecies. $1,150 or 2,300 days. Dealing with this next argument makes me feel as if I'm dealing with the claim that we've all heard that Jesus changed the Sabbath to Sunday or the like. It's one of those have been there and done that kind of things. Nevertheless, no matter how often we have been there and done that, it's important to look at this again because the argument appears again and again. In a nutshell, the argument is that the 2,300 evening and mornings of Daniel 8:14, or as it's often translated, 2,300 days, are really just 1,150 days, because the phrase evening and morning refers, it is claimed, to the daily sacrifices. And because there were 2 sacrifices per day, 2,300 really means only 1,150 days. Well, how valid is this charge? Well, just very quickly, it's very interesting that the vast majority of Bible translations always refer to it as 2,300. King James, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 days. The ASV, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 evenings and mornings. The New American Standard, the NAS, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 evening mornings. And he said unto me, for 2,300 the evening mornings. That's the NAV edition. The RSV, and he said unto him, unto 2,300 evenings and mornings. The NRS, and he answered, for 2,300 evening and mornings. The New King James, for he said unto me, unto 2,300 days. The WEB, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 days. The RWB, and he said unto me, unto 2,300 days. Young's literal translation, and he said unto me, till evening and mornings, 2,300. Now, this is just a smattering. Go yourself, find some Old Testament and look at the different translations. None of them translated the text as 1,150 days. Interestingly enough, I have 2 versions of the Septuagint. This is an ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible that predates Christian times. And both in the ancient Greek, translate Daniel 8:14 as 2300. The Vulgate, an early Latin edition of the Hebrew Bible, translates it as 2300 as well. In fact, I found only one version, today's English version, the TEV, which uses 1150 days. Yet listen here, 1150 days isn't a translation. It's an interpretation. It's an interpretation based on the premise that Daniel 8 is dealing with Antiochus Epiphanes. See, here's the issue. The 2300 days, if you take the 2300 days, even as literal 2300 days, it comes out to 6 years, 4 months, and 20 days. Now, we know that Antiochus' profanation of the temple, which is supposedly the focus of Daniel 8 and the little horn, lasted 3 years to the day. That's using a 360-day calendar, or exactly 1,080 days. Thus, taken literally, 2,300 days doesn't fit the Antiochus interpretation at all. It's not even close. So instead, what they do is they argue that it's really 1,150 days. They divide it in half, and that comes closer, but it's still 70 days off from what we know the length of time Antiochus was there. So it still doesn't fit Antiochus, even when they cut it in half. Now, but the fact is, this isn't talking about Antiochus. How could it? The time prophecy doesn't fit either way, either 2,300 days or with the attempt to divide it in half, 1,150. It doesn't fit. Now, putting aside the Antiochus interpretation, putting aside that, the 1,150-day argument is based on the notion that the text refers to the Tamid, or daily sacrifice offered in the sanctuary, in the New Testament, in the Old Testament wilderness, that was offered twice a day. However, and I do believe we are going to eventually get some of this material in the references, Dr. Gerhard Hassel in the BRI series expounds on this argument in detail. And he shows that this sacrifice, which is really viewed as one sacrifice happening twice a day, is always depicted in the sequence morning and evening, not as in Daniel 8:14, which is evening morning. Catch this. The sequence in Daniel 8:14 is opposite the sequence used in every reference to the daily service. Hassel wrote, no exception to the sequence appears in the Old Testament. So you see, there's always saying that it's one way, it's morning and evening, and and that's how it is in the sacrifices. But Daniel is evening, morning, erev boker, evening, morning, not morning, evening. Thus, the point is, if Daniel 8:14 was talking about the daily sacrifices, why didn't it use the same sequence of that the Bible uses when it talks about the daily sacrifice? But it doesn't. Therefore, there's no justification for having the 2,300 days. In fact, what's fascinating is that the sequence, evening and morning in Daniel 8:14, is the same sequence found in the Genesis 1 creation account, talking about literal days. Vayehi erev, vayehi boker, yom echad, and there was evening, vayehi erev, vayehi boker, and there was morning, yom echad, day 1. Vayehi erev, vayehi boker, yom sheni, and there was evening, and there was morning, yom sheni, day 2. Vahi erev, and there was evening, vahi boker, there was morning, yom shalishi, and there was evening, morning, day 3. Notice the sequence, evening, morning, and it's the same sequence that's found in Daniel 8:14. And he said unto me, unto 2,300, erev boker, evening, morning, just as you find in The Genesis creation count, the language is not exact, but the sequence is exact. Evening, morning, opposite of what you find with the daily sacrifice. Thus, the argument that Daniel 8:14 is talking about the daily sacrifices and therefore is 1150 days doesn't have any validity. And that's why almost every single Bible has translated it as 2300, dealing with the 2300 days. $1,150 days or 2,300 days. Dealing with this next argument makes me feel as if I'm dealing with the argument that we've all heard: Jesus changed the Sabbath to Sunday or the like. It's one of those have been there and done that kind of things. Nevertheless, no matter how often we've been there and done that, we need to do it again. We need to go there and do it again because the argument appears again and again. Now, the argument is basically this. It's that the 2,300 evening and mornings of Daniel 8:14 are really just 1,150 days, because the phrase evening and morning refers, it is claimed, to the daily sacrifices. And because there were 2 sacrifices per day in the temple, 2,300 really means only 1,150 days. 2,300 sacrifices, 2 a day, comes out to 1,150 days. Anyway, that's the argument. What is, or is there any validity to this claim? Well, first of all, let's just look at a few translations, and you'll see that the vast majority of translations translate it as 2,300, either 2,300 days or 2,300 evening and mornings. If we know the King James, and he said unto me unto 2,300 days. The ASV, and he said unto me unto 2,300 evening and mornings. And he said unto me, this is the NAS, for 2,300 evening mornings. The NAB, and he said unto me, for 2,300 evening and mornings. The RSV, and he said unto me, and he said unto him, unto 2,300 evening and mornings. The NRS, and he said, and he answered him, for 2,300 evening and mornings. The New King James, and he said unto me, for 2,300 days. The WEB, and he said unto me, until 2,300 days. The RWB, and he said unto me, until 2,300 days. Young's literal translation, and he said unto me, till evening, morning, 2,300. These are, as I said, just a few. In fact, go study on your own. Go check out a bunch of Old Testament translations yourself. And I believe that you will find the vast majority, all of them, translating it as 2,300, not 1,150. I have 2 versions of the Septuagint. It's an ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. It dates to pre-Christian times. And both these versions of the Septuagint translate Daniel 8:14 as 2,300. The Vulgate, an early Latin edition of the Hebrew Bible, also translates it as 2,300. In fact, I have found only one version, the TEV, I think that stands for Today's English Version, which uses 1,150 days. Now, I hadn't had a chance to check at that. In the later edition of it, they changed it. I don't know. But either way, it doesn't matter. The point is, 1,150 isn't a translation. It's an interpretation, one based on the premise that Daniel 8 is dealing with our good friend here, Antiochus Epiphanes. See, here's basically the problem, and here's the issue. The 2,300 days, if taken literally as a literal 2,300 days, comes out to 6 years, 4 months, and 20 days. Okay, 6 years, 4 months, 20 days. Now, the problem is Antiochus' attack and profanation of this temple, which is supposedly the focus of Daniel 8, and that's who the little horn supposedly is, lasted 3 years to the day. And using a 360-day calendar, that comes to 1,080 days. Thus, The 2,300 days, if taken literally, doesn't fit. It's not even close. So what do? Well, they argue, well, it's not really 2,300 days. It's only 1,150 days. Now, that's fine, except there's one problem. It's certainly closer, but it's still 70 days off. So even with interpreting it not as 2,300, but as 1,150 to try to get it to fit Antiochus, it doesn't fit. It still doesn't fit, even when cut in half. And that's because this prophecy is not talking about Antiochus. How could it? The time frame is off, among a whole bunch of other things as well. Now, putting aside the Antiochus argument, which is really the foundation of all, the 1,150-day argument is based on the notion that the text refers to Hatamid, the daily sacrifice, or in the sanctuary. Okay, it's talking about the daily sacrifice offered twice a day. They call it Hatamid. Well, actually, the phrase Tamid refers to a whole bunch of things in the daily service, which that means the continual, Hatamid. Anyway, that's the argument. And because that's offered twice a day, that's what it's talking about. However, and Dr. Gerhard Hassel goes into details on this, and I believe we will have this eventually in the resource section on the website. Hassel has expounded on this in detail, and he said that the reference to this sacrifice is always depicted in the opposite sequence of Daniel 8:14. It's not evening and mornings as in Daniel 8:14, but it's always morning and evening. Okay, in other words, the sequence in Daniel 8 is opposite the sequence used in every reference to the daily service. The sequence is always depicted morning sacrifice, evening sacrifice. Daniel 8:14 is evening, morning, not morning, evening. No exception, wrote Hassel, to the sequence appears in the Old Testament, close quote. Now, if Daniel 8:14 was talking about the daily sacrifice, why didn't it use the same sequence as the daily sacrifice, morning and evening? But it doesn't. It uses, Daniel 8:14 uses the opposite, evening and morning. Thus, it's not talking about the daily sacrifice. Therefore, there's no justification for having the 2,300 days. In fact, the evening and morning sequence in Daniel 8:14, though it's the opposite of the sequence of the daily sacrifice, it's the same sequence found in the Genesis 1 creation account regarding the days of creation. Vahi erev, vahi boker, yom echad. Vahi erev, there was evening. Vahi boker, and there was morning. Yom echad, day one. Vahi erev, evening. Vahi boker, morning. Yom sheni, and there was evening and there was morning, day two. Vahi erev, vahi boker, and there was evening, morning. Yom shalishi, day three. Okay, in each sequence, notice the sequence, evening, morning, as in Daniel 8:14, appears in the Genesis account. Now, it's not the same exact language. The language is a little bit differently, but the sequence is the same. Erev boker, evening, morning, thus giving powerful evidence that Daniel in Daniel 8:14 was talking about days. Thus, contrary to the argument that you often hear, there is no basis to believe that the 2,300 evening morning of Daniel 8:14 is anything other than the way most every Bible has translated it, and that is 2,300 days.
So yeah, I hear a lot of nonsense about, we know it's Antiochus Epiphanes is in view there, even from people who just want Adventists to be wrong. It's like Adventists didn't invent the day for year prophetic interpretation. It's consistent hermeneutics. Sorry, Chris Lucas. You don't know enough about prophecy to say what you say about people. It's really disgusting that people are liars and just simping for Ellen White, as if Ellen White came up with the interpretation or something, as if that were true when it's not. Like she invented a day for a year. Come on, bro. It's getting tired, man. So you got to ask yourself, if its real purpose in view of Daniel 8 is to talk about the daily being taken away by Antiochus literally, why is it listed everywhere else, everything associated with the temple and the daily service? Listed morning and evening, Tamid. Why is Tamid always associated in literal terms exactly the opposite way? But the way here in Daniel 8 is phrased like the days of Genesis, the evening and then morning. That's why the translation in the King James is days, because it is days, because it's representing that as it's associated prophetically with what's typing this ministry of Christ, which just throws open the door to the reality of. Now let's think about this for a second. Do you think every detail in Scripture? I heard on Answering Adventism that Adventists don't believe in evangelical versions of inspiration of Scripture, every word or whatever. Well, if you think it came down one letter at a time in a hat with your face stuffed in a hat with a magic rock, or if you want to think, hey, it's like, look, dude, Adventists were interpreting it wrong. We're thinking it was like that too. But it's indefensible. See Michael Heiser on this. Not an Adventist. Many Adventists still do hold it. They practically invented King James onlyism. So they say. I'm on your side if you're King James only, in the sense that you take the Bible seriously. I would just say it's just indefensible, man. That being said, in other words, charity, folks, got to have charity. And to go around talking about, they're just trying to make their false prophet. No, it was a Baptist who made the false prophecy. They believed him. But that has nothing to do with mistakes people make if they're admitted. The question is a day for a year appropriate? The answer is, I think so. We have texts that suggest it. If you don't, if you can find the commentaries saying how it's not a very appropriate way to treat the text from textual critics, but they don't often believe in the not necessarily, but often they're analyzing the text from man's side. Do we believe that God inspired it on some level? I do. I think it's exactly how he wants it. It's hard to exactly know how to work that out, but I would say this. Do you think there's a reason that in the prophetic literature that maybe the fact that it's associated with the cleansing of the temple, yet is associated with days, and we know that the lunar calendar is used in all prophetic time periods, and yet that lunar calendar was never actually used historically, but yet the prophecies were to be interpreted for actual historic time to actually know when things were going to occur according to the text, like Daniel's 70 weeks, for instance. And yes, they are weeks. They're not heptads. They're weeks. If you think the Bible should be translated consistently, and if you do, then they're weeks. It's funny how nobody seems to care about that until they want to refute the truth. Also, let's just step back a second. Do you believe that God planned on calling back all peoples of the earth through Israel and Jesus, who brought forth Christ, the Israelites, the Jewish people? Maybe you think I'm replacement theology. Let me ask you this. No, you don't replace God's plan to call back every man, woman, and child on the earth through Christ and replace it with separating them from the Lord's people. Israel, the first covenant people of God, established the church. They established the oracles of God, and we received it from them. And we'll all forever be grateful for that and have respect and honor for that. Replacement theology is saying the Jewish Messiah didn't establish his Jewish covenant with his Jewish church that he established in the first century, and then say it's some other thing, as if he hasn't come to be the savior of Jews already. He did. Do you think every Jew that ever lived is saved? Well, that'd be nice if God's judgment panned that out. The problem is the church was established by Jews, and you should recognize that, because he is the promises to Abraham. I dare you to disagree. I dare you. I dare you to tell me he didn't establish his church with his first covenant people. I dare you. Who's replacement theology here, really? No, he established his church with his Jewish brethren, and they took it to the world as God intended from the foundation of it. Now, with that in mind, if you can find that agreeable, and you should, then you ought to realize any prophetic literature that's stretching down till the end of time, like Daniel and the book of Revelation, anything to do with the covenant between God and man, and that there's a spiritual power opposing that. Do you think they care about a Jewish temple that sacrifices are finished in? Because the Christ, the Lamb of God, has been sacrificed? No. And Daniel 8 and Daniel 11 are closely linked linguistically. And Daniel 11 speaks of that person is going down to the end of time. What does that mean? It means the real focus of prophecy is the gospel of Christ and the new covenant, which was God's intention to bring back all the peoples of the earth, which fell in Eden before Abraham was even called. Do not say the Lord has utterly separated me from his people. Did God change on that? Did he want two different groups of people when he said that? Does he want that now? No. He's calling all people everywhere to repent and believe in Jesus. And any prophetic literature trying to be applied to Antiochus Epiphanes when there's a bigger picture going on here. And by the way, if you say Daniel 9:27 and covenant language doesn't have anything to do with Christ, here's the problem. Daniel 9 and 11, and you look up the word covenant, this bad power in Daniel 8 and it's tied to Daniel 11, king of the north, the little horn from Daniel 7. He's opposing a covenant, a holy covenant. What covenant do you think that is? Is that the Antichrist's covenant? Because you see language of a covenant in Daniel 11 or Daniel 9 and 11. You think that's the Antichrist covenant, like in Daniel 9:27? Well, here's your problem. No, he's opposing the holy covenant, and he's the bad guy. So if you make Daniel 9:27 about some Antichrist covenant, there isn't a single verse in Daniel referring to the new covenant that Christ brought. Now, let me ask you, do you believe in the inspiration of Scripture? Do you believe God is sovereign? Do you believe God has foreknowledge? Do you believe that God set forth Christ from the foundation of the world to call back the nations and bring glorious salvation and send his spirit to all who would believe? Do you believe that? Do you really believe it? Because if you did, you ought to see that anything prophetic is going to be dealing with the Messiah, his ministry, and his salvation. So if you don't know a lot about prophecy, you probably shouldn't be uncharitable to people who have a certain view and assume you know why they don't believe it, because you might just be trampling on God's truth. Anyways, love ya. God bless.
I'm not who you think I am. Whoa. They call me sort of pop can man. Whoa. And I don't feel well with pressure. Such a friendly gesture now. Just keep me out of the freezer. And don't give me the cold shoulder. 'Cause I am just a fragile can.